The conflict in Syria is certainly one of the more controversial ones due to the amount of disinformation that exists. And the disinformation in particular, in the particular case of a chemical weapons attack in Damascus, is what I want to focus on here, because it is an issue that I think many pundits, members of the left media have kind of shied away from. There is a lot of disinformation on behalf of Assad's regime in regard to that chemical weapons attack in Douma, which happened on April 7th of 2018. And so we're going to bring on an incredible reporter. He was based in Syria for several years. Patrick Hilsman is his name, and his work has appeared in The Intercept, Alternet, Al Jazeera, and Quartz. He's gonna help us go through all of the various points that have been brought up about that chemical weapons attack, what the motivation was, why there's disinformation, and then based on that evidence, based on that information, you can make a decision for yourselves. But before we get to the first question, I just want to note, there's a difference between demanding US intervention, which we have never done. I certainly do not want US intervention in Syria, and just whitewashing the war crimes of a literal dictator in Syria. You can be in favor of pushing back against US intervention and demanding that the US lift sanctions while also acknowledging the war crimes of a brutal dictator like Bashar al-Assad. With that said, I want to ask the first question, and Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start off with let's get to the very beginning of this, which is, what would Bashar al-Assad's motive be in conducting a chemical weapons attack in Douma in April 7th of 2018?
Sure, I'm just gonna start with a minor correction. I reported from Syria for several years, but I wasn't ever actually based there because there's visa restrictions that would have kept me out, but I've been on the ground a lot. But onto your first question, the motive is very simple. It's that neighborhood of Douma was encircled for years, was part of a very brutal campaign between extremist rebels and the government wanted to take the neighborhood. So they dropped chemical weapons, they dropped chlorine, and within 48 hours, the neighborhood surrendered. It's not rocket science. It's a pattern that we've seen in a lot of warfare. People tend to brutalize and double down on civilian populations that are unwilling to surrender.
And so why would he use a chemical weapon here? And there is a little bit of, at first it was thought that it was a nerve agent. That was what was alleged by the United States. That turned out to be untrue. It was not a nerve agent, but there was evidence by the OPCW that chlorine was used in this chemical weapons attack. Why would it be chlorine?
Well, initially when reports came out that there was a chemical weapons attack, a lot of journalists, myself included, suspected that it was unlikely that this time it was a nerve agent, because in 2017, the Assad regime used nerve agents, sarin specifically, on the Idlib town of Khan Sheikhoun and killed over 100 people. After that, there was a retaliatory airstrike on the Shayrat air base, which was a pretty significant blow in terms of the geopolitics of it. And I thought that it was rather unlikely that they would use a nerve agent again, because that had triggered a response internationally. But chlorine is different, because chlorine is a dual purpose weapon. And it's very easy to deny that you're using it as a weapon because it has civilian purposes. And it's also incredibly hard to test for in dead bodies. And survivors usually won't have any signs if they're lucky enough to survive. So it's an easy weapon to deny. And what makes it so effective and what makes it useful is the same thing that made it useful in World War I, which is that it sinks and it's highly toxic. So in Douma in particular, there were a lot of fortifications that were being used by the rebels that the Syrian regime, even with Russian air support, was having a hard time taking out. And we've seen other OPCW reports that deal with some of these chlorine attacks. And a lot of the time we see a pattern of them being deployed against areas that are seen as fortified by the regime.
So Patrick, let me ask you a series of quick questions here. For the folks at home who don't know what the OPCW is, what is it?
The OPCW is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And it's a UN adjacent body that is charged with monitoring compliance with the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as well as now investigating violations of the Convention on the Prohibition for Chemical Weapons.
All right, and some theorize that the OPCW in this case was basically acting on behalf of the United States of America. Well, did they agree with everything America said about the Douma attack?
No, the preliminary and later OPCW reports completely contradicted the United States line on the Douma attack. The United States said that it was a nerve agent attack, which in 2017 in Khan Sheikhoun, there was a nerve agent attack. But in Douma, it wasn't a nerve agent attack, it was a chlorine attack. So the premise under which the United States and France and Britain bombed nerve agent production facilities was faulty because it wasn't a nerve agent attack. So there is actually a scandal here that the United States acted in a way that wasn't based on the intelligence that was accurate. They could have retaliated accurately, let's say, but it wasn't. This particular attack was not a nerve agent attack, it was a chlorine attack. So the OPCW completely contradicted the United States.
Yeah, and by the way, even if you thought it was a nerve agent attack, it doesn't mean that you think the right policy is to bomb Syria. I never understood the logic of saying, I can't believe Assad killed children, let's go kill other children in Syria.
Right, because naturally the only reaction to knowing that somebody was murdered is to start a gigantic war.
Right, that makes no sense, yet some people online seem to believe that that's the only option available. But what kind of obstacles did the OPCW face as they were looking into the Douma attack?
Well, we actually have a really unique situation with Douma, whereas the fact that the Russian Federation sort of launched a media offensive before the OPCW was able to get its work done. So within 48 hours of the chlorine attack on Douma, the area surrendered to the regime, which makes a false flag theory rather unusual. It would be rather unusual to gas your own positions and then subsequently surrender for no reason. But there is like a certain logic to the actions that have been taken against civilians because it's a kind of brinksmanship that helps push people out of the areas that they're in, and we've seen it a lot in the past. It's nothing new.
So let's talk.
Go ahead. And so a lot of the people who were witnesses to the attack knew right off the bat when Douma fell that they would be subject to screening by something that's called the Center for Reconciliations, which is a wing of Russian military intelligence with a mil.ru web address, undeniably military. And a lot of the interviews with the survivors that ended up in the press and ended up in a lot of chemical weapons denialist literature were actually conducted by the Russian Center for Reconciliations, which is of course against international law. It's against international law to hold civilians in a military facility and to extract televised statements from them, which is what happened.
Yeah, so I'd like you to elaborate on that a little more because I want you to discuss evidence tampering, right? So as the OPCW is trying to invest this chlorine attack, they ran into some issues. You mentioned the topic of witness tampering. Elaborate on that further. I'd like to learn more.
Well, so there were a number of essentially publicity stunts that were carried out in the aftermath of the fall of Douma. And one of the most famous ones is that a young child, I believe his name was Hassan Diab, was captured by and he was filmed in a hospital among many frightened civilians who believed that they may have been exposed to chemical weapons. It's likely that some of the civilians at that hospital were not exposed to chemical weapons and were just reacting to the news that other people had been killed. Naturally, you would want to get hosed down in that situation. But this boy was featured on a lot of news articles and a lot of television stations because the footage of the actual crime itself that showed like 40 plus bodies, dead children's faces is horrifying footage. And that's the footage that's been used as forensic evidence. But this is a problem that comes with mass media is that they are very reluctant to show actual violence. So instead of showing the evidence of the actual crime, which was a pile of dead bodies without external injuries, a lot of the news media showed footage of frightened survivors getting hosed down, which is less violent. And the Russian Federation seized upon this, captured the boy that was in this footage, captured his father, and then extracted a confession from them at a military base in violation of international law before the OPCW was allowed to interview him or was even allowed on the ground. And if you want to talk about evidence tampering, this was in broad daylight and it's extraordinary witness tampering.
Yeah, well, a couple of things that arise out of that. Number one, Assad said that maybe there wasn't any chemical attack at all, but we have the kids and the adults with foam coming around their mouths that we actually have video of because the Russians did propaganda. So if Assad was the victim of this chemical attack, wouldn't he want the OPCW to go in right away and get all the relevant information?
Presumably. I mean, the one thing that's interesting about when you talk about the OPCW issue, you have to talk about the leaks that came out from WikiLeaks when an early draft of the investigation was released to WikiLeaks, and it showed signs that the investigators at the time were unable to gain access to Douma as quickly as some of the propaganda outfits that Russia let in. So before the OPCW investigators were even allowed into Douma, according to safety pretexts, a lot of regime sympathetic journalists were allowed in. So they were in there manipulating the scene. They, according to the leaked OPCW documents, had blocked off access to the main apartment where most of the dead people were found, and they forced regime minders to accompany the inspectors. Survivors were blocked from speaking with the OPCW and were held illegally on military facilities. And this is it's not proper. It's interfering with an investigation.
So in fact, we got several of the alleged witnesses that were part of a conference held by the Russians in 2018. And so there was an interaction that stood out, and I wanted everybody to watch that. Let's watch.
Ambassador Shulgin.
Yes.
Anna Holligan, BBC News. I just wanted to know why you thought it was more important to put these possibly valuable and vulnerable witnesses in front of the media before allowing the OPCW investigators to speak to them, as the OPCW had requested.
Как я уже сказал.
Just like I already said, Russia, after what happened in Douma on 7th of April, Russia turned to the technical secretariat requesting for immediate dispatch of the OPCW team for investigating the incident. We did everything to speed up that.
Is that true, Patrick?
Clearly not, because from what we can see, even that press conference is a confession, because there they sit with witnesses, or so-called witnesses according to them, and they admit fully these are our reasons for blocking access to these witnesses from the investigation. And a lot of the leaked documents that have been put forward feature what is presumably interviews with some of these people after they were being held illegally. So it's staggering evidence of witness tampering.
So let's move on to the actual OPCW investigation. What evidence did the fact-finding mission find that confirmed that this was in fact a chlorine chemical attack?
So there were specific, I have to point out that I'm not a chemist. Okay, so this is stuff that's available online that people should read. But for starters, 2 canisters were found, both of which were deformed to a point that they clearly were dropped from the air. One of which was found on a bed at a location that's referred to as location 4 in the OPCW report. And another one was found on a roof terrace at a location that's referred to as location 2 in the OPCW report. The canister that was found at location 4 on the bed leaked very slowly, right? And as a result of that, 0 people were killed at the location where there was a canister on a bed. Over 40 people were killed at the location where there was a canister on the roof terrace, location 2. And presumably the reason that this happened is that people were unaware that the gas was coming from above them, and the attack happened at night. So Syrians know very well that when there is a chlorine gas attack, you go up because chlorine sinks. And there's footage from Aleppo in 2016 showing people doing exactly this when very obvious chlorine gas is pouring out. And in Douma, they would have smelled gas and they would instinctively would have headed upstairs. Their eyes would have been burning, it would have been pitch black, and they would have had no clue where the gas was coming from.
So I do want to go to this video that'll help the audience visualize what the scene looked like. So not only did the OPCW do its investigation, there were a few independent investigations that followed, including one that was done by the New York Times. They put this video together, and I want you to take a quick look at what that scene looked like to help visualize what Patrick just shared with us.
Now we'll look at the bomb. Its rigging and casing tell us who dropped it. Frost tells us when it happened. And black residue indicates chlorine was used. The bomb itself is a crude chemical weapon, a pressurized chlorine tank designed to blow open on impact. And this debris tells us it was rigged to fall from the sky. This matters because Syria controls the airspace and opposition fighters don't have aircraft. Scattered around are small wheels and axles. And here, in the tangled remains, we see straps, another wheel, and fins. When we reassemble this twisted metal in our model of the balcony, it becomes a cylindrical rigging, and it fits right onto the canister. This is almost identical to the rigging on a second bomb found in Douma that day. Straps and hooks so it can attach to a helicopter's release system. Rear fins to create drag and stabilize the bomb as it falls. And small axles and wheels so the bomb alternatively can be rolled out of a helicopter.
So again, they're not going based off of what the OPCW report indicated. The New York Times does its own investigation into this, and they have the exact same findings. 2 canisters were discovered, and both of them tested positive for chlorine. Canisters were dropped from the air, which is relevant because again, the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad's regime, controls the airspace. The canisters match the holes in the building through which they fell. Canisters had imprints on them from the objects they hit on their way down. And as you had mentioned, one canister was lodged in the roof, the other one landed on a bed. So relevant information. Cenk, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, so actually 2 quick things. I can't, Patrick, I can't quite understand how folks can see that video and see the imprint of the parts of the building that the bomb clearly crashes through, and then say, no, it wasn't dropped from the sky. How could they have possibly gotten the same exact imprints on that missile, basically that canister, and caused that amount of damage in the building if it wasn't dropped from the sky?
I mean, it would be. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but it would be very hard. It would be incredibly hard. And a lot of the people that have tried to deny this atrocity have pointed to the fact that the cylinders don't have as much damage as they would have if they were dropped from several kilometers up, as some kind of evidence that they weren't dropped from the air at all. But this is a red herring, because the fact is that in order to avoid ground fire, actually a lot of the time helicopters will fly closer to the ground, around like 150 meters, because it means that the amount of time that you can actually get a bead on them if you're an anti-aircraft gunner is much shorter. So a lot of the time it's safer, especially in urban environments, for aircraft that are performing bombing runs to do it at a medium or lower altitude. And that would be consistent with a lot of footage that we've seen. We even have footage of the Russians flying the same kind of helicopters the Syrian regime uses, specifically talking about how they fly low to avoid ground fire.
Right, yeah, they're gonna go through all of that and then surrender the next day.
Yeah.
Seems unlikely to say the least.
After planting 40 bodies pre-rigor mortis with no external signs of injuries, yet not planting any at a scene at which they allegedly planted a canister on a bed. It doesn't make any sense.
Right, the bed one doesn't have any casualties. The one that clearly crashes through the building does, but yet, it was on a bed. All right, so how about the toxicology report?
Yeah, so initially, based on a very early preliminary meeting of toxicologists from the OPCW draft that was leaked from the early stages of the investigation, some toxicologists in a 1-hour meeting looked at the footage of the dead bodies from Douma and assessed that they felt that some, not all, some of the symptoms were inconsistent with chlorine poisoning. But a lot of that had to do with 2 assumptions. One was the assumption that white foaming would not occur when people are exposed to chlorine. And the second was the assumption that people in this building would have been aware of where the gas that was hitting them was coming from. And in this very preliminary toxicology report, there are comments from the toxicologists saying that they don't understand why the victims didn't just run outside, right? And that's, okay, like that's a worthy comment, but it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny of understanding how people in that area have been living for years, because they are used to seeing basically stairwells as like the safest place in the city, because generally speaking, that's the strongest structure in a building. And on the whole, when you're being bombed, like being buried in the rubble of a building is a fate worse than death. But on the whole, you're still statistically probably a little bit safer if you're inside of a building. So people will make choices between, do I get crushed to death in here, or do I risk it out on the street? And a lot of these early assessments were based on kind of like a wrong assumption about how people behaved. And also subsequently, what has become apparent is that there's very little photographic evidence of people that have actually died of chlorine poisoning, because it's not the kind of thing that your doctor can't just like gas someone with chlorine and then take photos of each stage in the poisoning process. It's something that we generally don't have a big visual record of, right? Mm-hmm. We have accounts of it from World War I, which actually do feature people recounting there being white foaming. And then interestingly enough, there was a chemical accident in China in 2005 when an identical chemical, molecular chlorine, was released in an industrial accident, and it killed a large number of people. And indeed, a photo from that incident shows that a young woman was killed and that there was white foam coming from her mouth. And it looks identical to the victims in Douma.
Patrick, we talked about why the Douma attack in Syria was a chemical attack, and it was from the air, and hence likely done by Assad's forces. But following the investigation, there were a few so-called whistleblowers. They emerged from within the OPCW to sow doubt about the outcome of the report. The first one was Ian Henderson. What were his allegations against the OPCW findings?
Well, Ian Henderson was attached to the investigation a little bit later on, and he's a former artillery officer in the South African military. And he was brought on to try and investigate some of the munitions that were at the scene. But apparently he sort of went rogue and produced his own report without the authorization of the OPCW, and then submitted it, I think, a day or two before the actual report was supposed to be filed. And the actual report itself alleged that Henderson believed that it was more likely that canisters had been manually placed at the scene than dropped from the air, according to him. But the problem with some of the claims that he's made is that they, at least from the perspective of other experts in these fields, don't really jive. First off, Henderson was not a ballistics expert, so his comment on where a canister might have ended up probably wouldn't have been the most well-informed. Secondly, he made a very grave error in measuring the size of the hole at, I believe, location 4 that the canister fell through. And subsequently, an investigative outfit called Forensic Architecture did an investigation of this and found that the hole actually was larger than the measurements that he put forward. And before anybody accuses Forensic Architecture of being some kind of neocon outlet, they're the ones that proved that the Israeli Defense Forces murdered Ahmed Erekat last year. And they've been known for not really exactly being very friendly to like pro-Washington agenda in the past, and they showed that the measurements that Henderson put in were inaccurate. And he also included commentary about what he saw as weathering on some of these canisters. He believed that marks on the canisters resembling rust were a result of the canisters having been left out for a very long time. But based on footage that we've seen, we know that that's not true, actually. The quote-unquote weathering on these canisters was a result of a chlorine reaction with water that happens when something depressurizes quickly and then moisture forms around it and then it combines with chlorine. So off the bat, we know that one of his major observations was incorrect, or two, sorry, at least. And then onto the third major observation is that he believed that one of the holes in the roof that we understand to be an impact hole from the canister crashing onto the terrace was actually a high explosive hole. And interestingly enough, the OPCW commented on a similar question that was raised by Russia about this hole. And the OPCW's comment was that it would be unusual for a hole like that to not have any fragmentation pattern. That's what, when a high explosive round goes off, it shoots shrapnel off in every kind of direction. And that's why in like Sarajevo, you see these things called Sarajevo roses, which are the splash pattern of a mortar shell going off. And in the case of location 2 in Douma, there was no splash pattern. So at least 3 of the observations that Henderson made casually are incorrect, at least. And from what we can understand, it seems that his overall thesis was not correct.
Well, one of the other things that I thought was fascinating was the fact that he had written this report. He had not leaked it to the public. Someone else had leaked it, although we don't know who. And it seems as though he felt the need to write this report from a place of authority, when in reality he didn't have he didn't have access to the entirety of the evidence. He wasn't part of this investigation the entire time, which is why he didn't have access to all of the evidence and all of the analysis necessary to draw a conclusion about it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, his tenure at the OPCW ended long before the more recent reports have come out, and it's clear from internal leaks and just from the entire way in which these investigations have been handled, at least semi-publicly in the past, that this wasn't within the normal framework of the investigation. He wasn't even attached to assist the investigation until it was already on the ground. And you have to understand that all this witness tampering that was going on, all those just batshit press conferences and witness intimidation that happened were before he even showed up in Douma. So he sort of, after the fact, arrived with his own thesis and felt the need to make a report about it. Now, I don't think that a person like that should be discounted, because if he has an opinion, he should voice it, and I don't have any problem with that. But it has not withstood scrutiny. It simply hasn't.
Right, and just to give everyone the statement by the OPCW in response to Ian Henderson, the OPCW said Henderson had played a minor supporting role in the investigation, so he didn't have access to all the evidence and wasn't qualified to comment. And they said his personal opinion, drawn from incomplete and inaccurate information, was contradicted by 3 independent studies. I have noticed online that sometimes people will post headlines regarding the OPCW's findings in regard to other alleged chemical attacks, and it'll say that the OPCW could not find enough evidence to support that it was a chemical attack. But that's not the Douma case involving a chlorine chemical attack. So understand that there have been many chemical attacks, and you have to be careful to ensure that you're reading headlines in regard to the specific chemical attack we're talking about here.
Yeah, I actually, Patrick, wanted to ask you about another so-called whistleblower. In the winter of 2019, someone from inside OPCW calling themselves Alex came out. So what were Alex's claims?
Well, Alex's claims were incredibly narrow, and it's very important to remember the fact that not one of these people has made any claim that the attack was staged ever. Just out there. And there was a very lengthy BBC podcast about the White Helmets and chemical weapons denial that came out. And the only correction that had to be issued for that podcast was that the whistleblower Alex, they, in the production of the BBC podcast, assumed that he believed some of the crazy theories that have been put forward by like Grey Zone and the Working Group on Syrian Propaganda. And so there was sort of the assumption that he believed that the attack was staged. And he specifically contacted the BBC to say, "I do not believe the attack was staged. This is misconstruing my belief. I just don't feel that the chlorine evidence was a slam dunk." So he had a very narrow criticism, feeling he felt that chlorine that was found at the location, or I'm sorry, not chlorine, that residues of chlorine that were found at the location could theoretically have come from a false positive from another substance. But the problem is that again doesn't withstand scrutiny of the further investigation, because Alex, like Ian Henderson, left before the investigation was over, and he was operating under the OPCW mandate that doesn't allow them to blame the perpetrator, right? So they only found reasonable grounds that there was a chemical weapons attack in Douma, because that's all they're allowed to conclude. They're not allowed to conclude who did it or like why it was done, name the perpetrator, etc. But in cases where there's been a separate body called the Incident Identification Team, the IIT, that's been commissioned by the OPCW to actually name perpetrators, we see that in other chlorine attacks, they conducted a series of tests in order to rule out non-molecular chlorine sources as false positives. And you can see, read the report on the Sarakev attack from the OPCW and the IIT, and it's very explicit as to how these chemical traces could not possibly have been from anything else except for molecular chlorine. And it's also worth noting that this is an area where there's not a lot of chlorinated water. Like it would be say the least, very, very unusual for there to be just chlorine every goddamn place on like a scene. It's just not really, it's not something that people have a lot of access to.
So, in researching for this, I wanted to really understand what the whistleblowers were alleging, because the way that the whistleblowers are reported on by outlets like the Gray Zone makes it appear as though there's just some definitive groundbreaking information that indicates that without a shadow of a doubt, this was not a chemical weapons attack. And I might have missed something. So I want to ask you, is there something that was uncovered, something credible that was uncovered by these alleged whistleblowers that proves that this might not have been a chemical weapons attack, that this might not have been a chlorine chemical attack?
No, nothing. I mean, even if you were to take everything, Henderson's a separate issue because he made some errors in his report, but if you were to take everything that Alex said and take it as gospel truth, which clearly people within the OPCW did not feel, if you were to take all of that, that would simply be evidence that they jumped to a conclusion. It would not be evidence that 40 bodies were planted by people who then surrendered. It's just evidence that he feels that it wasn't as conclusive as it would be. But they've not presented a shred of evidence that this incident was staged. And in fact, it's important to notice that on page 28 of the leaked, not of the official, of the leaked OPCW draft report, it says that it says that the team considered alternate injury events, but stressed that they are founded on few or no substantiated facts. What that means is there's no evidence of an alternate explanation. They found significant evidence of a chemical attack, some evidence that they felt was not conclusive, and no evidence that it was staged.
Okay, and there's this controversy about WikiLeaks offering $100,000 that Alex might or might not have taken. Tell us what that is.
I mean, WikiLeaks was offering a reward. They've sort of done these weird self-owns where they have released information that really contradicts the narrative that they've supported. Like a lot of the information in the leaked OPCW draft confirms reporting from the same time that said that the Russians were obstructing evidence, that civil defense, the white helmets, were being incredibly helpful to the OPCW, and so it's hard to it's hard to make a complete judgment on what the motives of these people are, but it hasn't survived scrutiny throughout the investigation.
So yeah, I just gonna say real quick, from my perspective, offering $100,000 for information you'd like to get is not journalism. So I think WikiLeaks did amazing work in the beginning, and I fully supported their actions. I don't think Julian Assange should have gone to jail under any of these circumstances, and it's an outrage that he was subjected to all of this. But once they started offering up money for the reports they would like to see, then they crossed the line to me, not in terms of putting them in jail or anything like that, but that isn't real journalism. And
it's disingenuous. And it's a fact that we just don't know if he took that money, and I don't think that it's necessarily proper to speculate that he did or didn't, because there's people can be completely genuine in their motives for wanting to say something and still be wrong. I mean, if Alex believes that the residual chlorine evidence that was found is insufficient, then that's a discussion to have. But Alex, according to him, does not believe that 40 bodies pre-rigor mortis with no signs of external injury were planted by people who then surrendered the next day.
Yeah, and that's a much more outlandish conspiracy theory, and one pushed by the guys that we're talking about here. And so not even backed up by their own so-called whistleblowers. But I just want to say one more thing about that in terms of the nuance, right? So when Douma first happened, I was a little skeptical about the timing. Then you know what I did? I looked at the facts, and the facts that we've been talking about for this entire time.
Right.
And then when you look at the facts, you go, oh, okay, now I understand why it fits into the pattern that it does, even though I'm naturally disinclined to believe the US government. And it turns out we were right, because the US government was lying. It was not a nerve gas attack, right?
Yep.
And so, but facts matter, and you should adjust your opinion based on the facts, not the facts around your opinion.
All right, so we're running out of time, but I wanted to go to this video from your reporting. I believe you're in Aleppo, if I'm not mistaken, and you're showing what a barrel bomb did to a building. There's a point in showing this video, so let's take a quick look. All right, so can you talk a little bit about that video, Patrick? Because I think it's relevant in debunking some of the other, I guess, myths about this war.
Yeah, sure. So that's footage that I took in June of 2014 in Aleppo, Syria. I'm not exactly sure what the neighborhood was, but we got there from the neighborhood of Hanano, which is in East Aleppo. And it was the scene of a barrel bomb that had blown up a building the day before. And there behind me, you see the white helmets digging through the rubble. They'd already rescued people from there, and they're just clearing out the rubble, doing banal, uninteresting rescue work, as rescue workers across the world do from Gaza to Yemen.
Yeah, there's certainly a disinformation campaign that alleges that the rebels overall, like a blanket statement, including the white helmets, are just terrorist groups. It's pretty gross stuff, but I thank you for sharing that video and showing some of the work that the white helmets were doing.
Patrick, last thing here. Is there any chance that Gray Zone, Aaron Monte, and the rest just didn't see this overwhelming evidence, didn't see the print patterns on the chlorine canister, didn't notice that Alex said, no, I don't think the event was staged, just missed all of this evidence?
They better believe it, because if they don't, they're going to hell. I just don't really know how else you can justify that. I mean, I assume that they do believe it, but there are things that they say that they don't believe and that they know are false. Like, for example, the BBC podcast that I mentioned, Mayday, was a very in-depth debunking of a lot of this stuff. And one of the people who worked on it was a translator named Abed Al-Qadir Habek. And as opposed to simply coming up with a reasonable response to this very thorough podcast, Gray Zone published a smear piece accusing this man of having been part of a suicide bombing against Shia civilians in the city of Refuting in Aleppo as they were being evacuated from the villages of Fua and Krafaya in Idlib, right? This is a well-known incident in which a person drove a blue truck into a crowd of civilians that included rebels, activists, government soldiers, white helmets, and people from the SARC, right? This was clearly an extremist that was bent on trying to disrupt a deal that was going on between the two sides in that city. And Abed al-Qadir Habek was a hero who rescued a child from that suicide bombing at great risk to himself and saved a life. And there's photos of him doing that. And these people have taken the most McCarthyite, disgusting, Islamophobic, war on terror, neoconservative smear imaginable, which is to call an innocent Muslim a hero, a terrorist, and accused him of being part of a suicide bombing. That McCarthyite is still up on their website, and they know that it's false.
All right, and look, and then they have allies like Jimmy Dore who claim that Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! Might be a CIA shill. So,
yeah.
I'd like to add something to that too. For several years, he's been going around on like his comedy show, showing this clip of I think it's Arnold Damon sniffing a backpack after the chlorine attack, telling people that if it was he doesn't even know what chemical was used, but saying that if it was sarin, that a person would die, or that it was chlorine, a person would die after smelling it. That's not true. That's not how these chemicals work. They're highly reactive chemicals, and when you expose them to oxygen, they have chemical reactions with oxygen. That's how chemistry works. So this is a red herring that's been put forward a lot, that a person would drop dead if they weren't wearing sandals at the site of a chemical weapons attack the day after, or if they sniffed a backpack that was in a chlorine attack. No, that's not true. Chlorine is lethal when it's in high concentrations in enclosed spaces, usually, like you saw in Douma. It would not be lethal days later. It's just such ignorance, and he's been running with it for years. It's ludicrous.
Well, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
All right, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.